everyone. Thanks for joining us here on Mom Squad. I'm Maureen Kyle, and this is a show where we tackle all sorts of parenting topics. And today, we are talking about the growing trend of mental health days for your kids. More school districts and states are expanding their permission for mental health days off of school. Arizona, Colorado, Connecticut, Illinois, Maine, Nevada, Oregon, Virginia, Washington, and Kentucky have all passed bills allowing kids to take a certain number of mental health days. Several other states have proposed legislation. But how do you know when to let your kids stay home? And how do you make the most of that day? Dr. Lisa Ramirez, a board-certified child and adolescent psychologist and specialist in schools, talks about these decisions. So we're seeing more and more headlines about mental health days at schools and in school districts.
Yeah.
Is it okay for kids to take a mental health day? Mm-hmm. We're used to them taking sick days when they're actually sick, like physically, like with a cough or with the flu. Where does mental health fall in all of that?
Yeah. So you've heard me say before that I think it's actually, the body is all one. And so you talked about physical health, like a cold. And I do think that there are some times where stress, maybe just feeling a little bit burnt out, which we can talk about, something like that, does just like you would if you were feeling a little bit run down. That mental health days, I think mental health can be such a loaded phrase, you know, but really there are times where a child's ability to take a step back and recharge or refill their cup can be really, really helpful. And I think it is meant with great spirit. There's legislation now in Ohio, you know, that you know, kids can maybe take up to 3 days. I think, you know, we'll see where that goes. But there's a lot of conversation, a lot of focus on it. But I think the important part is that we're helping parents and also kids know, what does that mean to take a mental health day?
So what does it mean?
Okay, so this is how I'll often say, right? Mental health days are really meant just like a physical health day, right? To recharge and feel better. So sometimes what happens is that you'll have a student who wakes up in the morning and maybe they're just feeling blue, right? There's just something off about the day, you know, and maybe they feel like maybe there's something going on in their life, right? We see a lot of grief that can cause a lot of stress. We see sometimes like around midterms or, you know, if there are big tests going on, sometimes if there's social stressors, right? There's been like a friend rupture or something's going on, you know, comments made, you know, something that just triggers, man, I don't want to go to school today. And so a mental health day used correctly is really meant to fill that emotional well-being cup. So I'll talk about what I see happening that I don't think is the best way to use mental health days. So often what will happen is that when you're not feeling great, your body will say, we just kind of need to chill. We need to take a rest. Like, let's lay in bed all day. Let's scroll, right? We're resting. We'll feel better if we do this. But actually, that's not a great way to use that mental health day because that doesn't refill anything. It's almost like if you take a cell phone charger and just unplug it. Yeah. You know, you actually need to do things that are going to help you feel a little bit more, you know, that you've worked towards something. So that could be on a nice day, taking a walk, you know, getting outside. Taking a walk is much better than laying in bed, scrolling, watching TV, because then what happens is you have like 18 hours of kind of not quite sleeping, not quite awake. Right. And it's not really quality, you know? So you have this whole quantity of what feels restful, but it's actually not, and it does the opposite, because if you've done that for a full day, your kid's gonna wake up the next morning and feel the exact same way. Yeah. But if they've gotten up, gotten dressed, taken a shower, gone for a walk, maybe tackled that assignment that is really stressing them out, or spent time with somebody like maybe a friend, a grandparent, you know, there are a lot of reasons that kids can feel either stressed out or down or sad or worried. And, you know, we have to make sure that on those mental health days, we're using them in ways that are going to actually counteract that, not just pause it.
That's a great point. So in that instance, do you recommend, like, I mean, if it is a cough or the flu, we go see a doctor. Is this a situation where then we go see a counselor or a psychologist, a psychiatrist, somebody who can help with any sort of guidance? Because sometimes coming from mom and dad, it just doesn't, it's not the same.
Oh, yeah.
Like if we say, well, you need to sit and journal, you know, then they're going to be like, whatever.
Right.
But if a doctor tells them that, it might have a better impact.
So this is what I'll say about that. Again, going back to physical and mental health really are part of that same body system. So if your child wakes up and they have a little bit of cold, maybe their allergies are pretty bad, you know, you might watch their symptoms, kind of maybe give them, you know, a little bit of maybe a vitamin, or maybe give them an allergy medicine, something like that, and just see if they're feeling better the next day. If you're starting to notice that there's fevers or, you know, something that's getting in the way of them being able, you know, tummy bug, something like that, then you say, okay, this symptom is going to tell me that I probably need to get some help. Maybe go to a doctor, get a strep swab, whatever, right?
Right.
And it's kind of same, I feel like, with mental health, right, and mental wellness, because I do think when we say mental health, we think a problem. But it's part of a whole spectrum, you know? So when we think about the symptoms that might tell us that we need support, you know, it's not every once in a while, maybe, you know, especially, we've talked before, right? Like middle school is around the age of puberty. There are hormones going on, right? Like if you're noticing that there's a little bit of a rhythm around that, then maybe, you know, you help support. How do we feel better if it's predictable, right? But sometimes we start to see that there are these feelings or patterns that start to get in the way of our children being able to get to school, to be able to engage in learning, to be able to socialize, to be able to make meaningful relationships, or even to take care of themselves, right? Not wanting to take a shower, not wanting to get dressed in the morning, you know, things like that. So when you start to see some of these feelings or these requests getting in the way of, we'll say, like daily activities, learning, socializing, that's when you probably need to reach out and say, hey, I need a gauge. Maybe it's your pediatrician, maybe it's a counselor at school. You know, certainly we have a lot of mental health professionals, and I do think that it's worth, as we're talking more about mental health days, we also talk more about mental health clinicians and supports. It's not one thing, right? Not every mental health provider is the same. You mentioned psychiatrists, psychologists, counselors, you know, social workers, all kinds of different supports. And depending on where you're getting it, school, doctor's office, right, seeking it out, it's a little bit different.
Yeah. Let's go back to just this whole, it's almost like a generational shift. I mean, even pre-COVID, there was this push to, you know, this child had perfect attendance record, you know, that was celebrated. And then when I think of taking a mental health day, I think of the 80s movie Ferris Bueller's Day Off, where it's like, yeah, I mean, a kid could really, you know, fake some symptoms and then just be like, well, I don't feel like doing this today. I know that there is, there's a lot of gray area when it comes to that. How do you know that your kid, like, what are some ways? Because I just worry about, well, if I do let my kid take a mental health day, when it's appropriate, well, then are they going to, I don't want to say fake it, but are they going to play up symptoms because they just don't feel like how do we make sure that we are getting a legitimate, emotion and symptom and mental health problem?
So there are a couple things that are right in that. So one, we need to talk about something called avoidance. Okay. So when we think about anxiety or worry, right? One of the things that our brain tells us is that if we avoid whatever it is, that we will feel better. And usually that's true in the moment, but in the long term it's not. Right? And so if there's something that your child or student is avoiding, and it's at school, right? Then that's probably a sign that maybe it's worth reaching out to understand, like, what is it about that? So is it a social situation? Is it academics, right? Right now we have a lot of pressure, more pressure than ever. You were talking about, you know, achievement and, you know, outwardly, you know, perfect attendance and things. And we are noticing that, especially teenagers, middle and high schoolers are taking a lot of that in. So are they avoiding something that makes them feel better in the immediate, but then is snowballing into something, right? Because every time they miss a school day, they're not only missing instruction, but they're also missing out on social interactions, right? And so it's kind of a double whammy. And so that's why I think mental health days can be wonderful ideas if used correctly, right? So that's the piece, is if you're starting to think that these mental health days are happening more and more frequently, these requests, you know, and you're starting either to see a pattern or it's getting in the way, then I think that, you again start to maybe seek out for support and see what could be going on. We don't always know as parents, right? I have kids, and my children don't always tell me why.
Yeah.
That's a really hard question.
It is.
Sometimes they don't even know the why.
Sometimes we don't know the why of our own mental health,
can you just tell me what's going on? And often, like you said, even adults aren't great with what we call insight, right, to understanding. And so sometimes it's a team that can help get to that, right? So I think that House Bill 30 is talking about 3 mental health days a year, right? So that seems to me reasonable, right?
Yeah.
That is maybe 1 or 2 in the first semester, maybe 1 in the second semester, and that can be opportunities to recharge. When your child is waking up every day, or it's more frequent, that's when, again, it's becoming a pattern we need to see how to support. On the other hand, right, the mental health days, I think, if we look at like adult burnout, right, kids get burnout too.
Yeah.
And so I've said before, often when we feel burnout, we feel overwhelmed, we feel like we have to do more. And sometimes the answer is actually stepping away just for a little bit so that we get to increase the quality, not just the quantity, of running ourselves into the ground. And those are, again, examples of when to step back. One of the things that I see that I do think is important to talk about is that it can be really hard for a parent, caregiver, to feel like they are adding to their child's discomfort. And this is one of the conflicts we see a lot, right? Is that my child's already stressed out. They're already sad. Why am I going to push them to do something that's obviously making them upset?
Yes.
And so this is where I think it's helpful. It can be helpful to have a conversation with somebody like me or support at school, because in the long run, right, them avoiding is maybe just perpetuating something that could be dealt with if we understood why that class is really hard, or why that social situation, is causing so much stress, because keeping them out of school, keeping them away, unless it's a major problem, and then you think about something, in the long run, that's not helping them to develop the ways and the strategies to move through problems, not just avoid it. And that's something that I think happens is parents can feel really guilty. There's a lot of guilt these days in parenting.
Oh gosh.
Right? So I think there's
That's
a lot
an understatement.
of guilt in saying, like, my child is upset, and so I don't want to add to that upset. But sometimes it's stepping in to help support and help kind of walk with them and saying, this is hard and we can do these things, but the more they avoid it, then the harder it becomes. Right. So that's the catch-22.
You're in and out of so many schools and districts. What do you think, there's so much we can do as parents, but what do you think the districts can do as they're considering mental health days? But then what other support systems do you, if administrators are watching or teachers watching, what can they do to make sure that kids are getting a healthy environment when they're in class, if they start to see stress or if they start to see some social problems?
Yeah, I think first and foremost, I do think we need to make sure that the adults surrounding these children, these students, understand, right? So that starts with the people in the building, right? So the administrators, maybe the teachers themselves, all of the adults in the building, right? And then also parents, so having maybe information about, if you're gonna roll out mental health days, what are some tips and strategies for helping your students succeed with those mental health days, right? I think that's really, really important. And that so helping to create that understanding and that awareness. And then I think we also need to make sure, because mental health, is showing up in a lot of places. I keep hearing this, right? That teachers are being asked to navigate mental health in the classroom, and that it's coaches on the field and stuff. And I do think that there's a lot of truth to that. And I also think that we can make information and support available as much as we can, so reaching out, schools, administrators can bring in partners like myself. There are a lot of us in the area, and I'm sure all around, that would love to come and give talks to teachers or parents, right? Or even have conversations about trends. Absenteeism has been increasing, school avoidance has been increasing, and so, we've talked to lots of districts about how to handle that. I do think that there are ways to infuse mental wellness into daily practices, so sometimes little things like a routine at the start of a class, even for 1 minute, maybe, it depends, right? Some kids, you mentioned, right, like tell your kid to journal. Yeah. There are actual strategies, like therapeutic strategies, like journaling, like mindfulness, relaxation, and breathing, that I think sometimes can be pulled out and sort of thrown around. And I think there's some good to that, right? We want strategies out there, but if you don't anchor them with, especially teenagers, about the why, then they're gonna throw that journal right back at you.
Right.
Why am I going to journal, right? But if you help sit them down and say, hey, sometimes things get stuck, you know, and sometimes just writing down some of those thoughts, even if nobody sees them, that can help. It's almost like unplugging that drain, right?
Yeah.
So just here, I don't ever have to see it, you don't have to show it to anybody, but maybe just try for 5 minutes writing something down, and we'll see if that either helps with the problem or if that helps you feel better. But if we just say, journal, here, listen to this app and do some deep breathing, right? Then I think sometimes that can feel a little bit dismissive. So we do want to include more of those things in daily strategies, but we have to help the adults and the teachers and, you know, those doing it, help them with the messaging of the why, and then those strategies and how to do them. But there are lots of ways to help bring like a calm, because kids are bringing in all kinds of things when they walk through those doors.
Right, and they're confused at that age because they haven't lived the life that we have to interpret what's happening in life. Are there any, when we're talking about wellness, are there any almost like preemptive strategies that we can start to instill? I'm just thinking, you know, your kid might not be having a problem now, but if they start some wellness practices before they start to get stressed out, or before there is a social issue, can that help them in the long run?
Yeah, well, I think there are some basic things that we take for granted, right? First and foremost, what we see a lot with teenagers is sleep. You know, sleep gets sacrificed. Sleep is actually a fundamental building block for wellness, both physical wellness, but also emotional, mental wellness. And so, you know, I'm not a big naysayer for social media. I think there's a lot of gray in there, but I do think that when technology, social media, they start to get in the way of things like sleeping or being able to rest, that's when we have to look at that, the quality of what's going on. But I am a big believer that there should be no technology in bedrooms, especially after a certain time. So sleep is a huge one, because even if kids say, oh yeah, I'm plugging in my phone, right? I do it, right? You know, in the middle of the night, I pop up and see what I've been missing, then you get dragged in. And to teenagers and middle schoolers, right? Things feel like big deals because they are, you know? I mean, you know, for me, who has a lot more time on this earth, you know, I realize like, well, that doesn't feel good, but I know it will pass. But to a 15, 17-year-old, right, things can feel so heavy. And to experience that like in the middle of the night or, you know, alone, and that can be heavy. So anyway, I think sleep is a huge one we need to be paying attention to. I think also things like nutrition. You know, making sure kids are showing up in the mornings with good, like, protein. You know, a lot of them will eat a lot of carbs. My kids are like that. They love to eat carbs in the morning. Right, but that wears off, right? So thinking about pieces like that. And then meaningful relationships are huge. So this is one that I don't think we've talked about enough. I know the Surgeon General just came out and talked about loneliness. Meaningful relationships and being able to have at least even one meaningful connection can be massive. And so if your child was one that had a lot of best friends and now for some reason had those ruptures and doesn't have at least one best friend, maybe two, that's concerning, right? You want them to have at least that one connection, and hopefully with an adult in their life. So sometimes that's us. Sometimes when we get into the teenage, it's not, right? But somebody that, you know, when they are having a bad day, that they can send that text to, or if they're feeling down, right? Somebody where there's unconditional, like, no matter what, you're great. I don't care what you look like, what you know, what you say, like, I just think you're fantastic. And that's usually what a best friend, what a meaningful relationship can do. And then I think being open about how we cope and how we handle those mental health days, those days where we're stressed out, bringing those more into conversations, because they're talking about it at school, you know, whether it's with adults or with each other. And that language, depression, anxiety, right, all those social media quizzes about, do you have all of these mental health diagnoses, right, all of that is out there. So creating, and we've talked about this, right, an open door, because you want to be one of the people that they come to, not somebody who brushes them away and says, I'm too uncomfortable to talk about that. They're going to get the information from somewhere. I feel like there's always that feeling of, I don't know what to say. I don't know how to open that door with my child. I don't know how to approach that. Do you have any advice on some of the language that parents can use to get a child to open up, or maybe at least start to get to the root of maybe some of their concerns or worries or stressors? So there are some great resources which I'll mention, and I think sometimes we overcomplicate things. So being present is huge, right? And I have noticed with my clients, patients, also my own kids, right? When I show up, I'm like, what's wrong?
Yeah.
Right? Remember we talked about the why.
Why?
You know, that feels really intense.
Yeah.
But if we're at dinner, or if we're out driving somewhere, right? If I say, hey, let's go, I don't know, to the library, go buy a book, right? And then it's an activity together, and then I can pepper in things, and there's that quality time. Usually things can come out, but we have to create environments where it doesn't feel like, hey, I'm paying attention to you right now because I want information. It's really hard, you know?
Right.
So when, again, we can start to plant the seeds for those conversations, maybe around a dinner table or before bed, or again, you know, a couple of colleagues of mine will often say, like, driving is one of the best ways to get information because they're not looking at you.
Yeah.
And, you know, so they're either sitting next to you, or if they're younger, a little bit behind. And so those conversations can happen, you know, they're not watching your facial reaction, and it's not that intensity of, you know, of having to sort of say it, answering that intense question while they're looking at you. I do think that there are, and sometimes it's more peer-to-peer, but there's like a website called Seize the Awkward, which is about peers having uncomfortable conversations with peers, but there may be videos on there about parents as well. Making Care Uncommon is another one that's really now looking at how teen distress can impact parents' mental health. I think, you know, I like a couple of podcasts, like Dr. Becky at The Good Inside. I think Lisa DeMore, a local psychologist, is great. And you can go on her podcast, and she has a few talking about, like, how do I get my teen to open up, you know, things like that. And so I do think that looking at some of those resources and seeing how they phrase things can be helpful. But teenagers and kids in general, they know when you're genuine.
Right.
And they know when you want something.
Yeah.
So I do think that, you know, understanding how you're approaching the conversation and really truly thinking about your intention and the spirit of how you're doing it.
Yeah.
And then the words are important, but not as important as how and whether or not you have that openness, right, is the... Tell me today about school is different than, oh man, all right, let's talk about school today. What's going on? And you can just tell, you know, but we often approach things from the
authoritative.
Yes.
Yes. Yeah. Just to loop it back around before we go to the mental health days at school, you mentioned that, you know, and we've seen some of the legislation throughout the country where it's, okay, well, you can have 2 days or 1 day. That's precious time. I mean, even as an adult who, if you've been working and you know you only get your 7 sick days a year, you have to decide, is this the day that I use it? So as a parent, I mean, I remember me going to the school nurse like every chance I could saying, I have a headache, I think I need to go home. Kids will take more than they're allotted. So as the parent who has to help them decide, how would you decide, yes, this is the day that we're going to use our precious time of our 1 or 2 sick days this semester?
So I think I would probably have those conversations early, right? And I also have children that have sometimes, you know, been like, oh, I have a headache today, you know? And so for physical illness, right, we tend to have some guardrails around, okay, is there a fever, right? Is there, you know, or do your lymph nodes feel a little bit swollen, right? Is there something that I can notice that looks like, you know, a cough, you know, something like that? And then we'll say, okay, but if you're staying home, right, then we're probably gonna monitor you or make a doctor's appointment, you know, but there's no technology, you know, so it is not a fun stay-at-home day, right? So we tend to limit TV, technology, and there are things that need to be done, or things, you know, or spend time with me, come around doing things. And I think the same can, and it's helpful to do that around mental health days too, right? So, you know, you're gonna get maybe 1 a semester, and let's talk about what that means. So if you're taking a day where maybe it's not, you don't feel sick, but you feel like it's gonna be really, really hard to get to school and to be able to do those things, let's talk about what that means and what would be the reasons to do that, right? So it's not that you wake up and you don't wanna go to school. That's different, right? But if there's something that's overwhelming to you, if there's a situation or you're feeling, you know, that you are waking up most mornings sad, or it's gotten to a point where now you feel like you need help, maybe then we make an appointment. So I think having those conversations early, you know, and again, for me, I look sometimes to see, you know, in the settings, and is there a pattern to when those things are happening, and trying to be proactive about it. I did want to mention, because you had asked school districts, I have seen some creative things coming. I think that schools are really, most are embracing sort of these conversations and what's coming, and I think some school districts are really looking forward to having those conversations with caregivers. Some are actually saying we may have things and activities that a child can do at school that aren't necessarily maybe going into the classroom, but maybe it's these other things that are aimed toward mental wellness. Because one piece too is sometimes even getting into the school building can be an avoidance piece. So I think that's a really creative way of approaching it too, is, you know, if you claim one of those mental health days, but you're still coming in, then there are other things that we can do. Maybe it's yoga or a reset opportunity. So I think there's a lot of creativity, and we'll be looking at the data, right? Once now the states are starting to do it, I think 2-3 years out, we'll have a lot of interesting information about how they're being used and if they're making a difference.
Which is so amazing. Just, I mean, it's so different than when I was growing up, and to have that resource, it's just incredible.
Yeah, and I think maybe my final note is that, of course, you know, I think sometimes right now there's a lot of messaging that everything's a crisis, and it can feel that way. There are a lot of things that feel a lot heavier than they did even pre-COVID, but I do think that kids have always had days where they just don't feel like themselves. We all have days like that. And I think I want us to really embrace those conversations about, you know, there are like sad days and bad days, and there are terrible days and overwhelming days. And sometimes even for me, like having those conversations, like, is this a funky day, or is this a terrible, overwhelming day? Right. You know, now if everything is terrible and overwhelming, that's maybe where sometimes you're gonna seek out the help. Yeah. But if it's a junky day and then we talk about how to get through that, those are conversations too. But we don't want kids to feel like every junky day is a crisis. Yes. We don't want parents to feel that way either, because then there's no room to just have a bad day.
Thank you again to Dr. Lisa Ramirez for all of her insight on how to handle our kids' mental health. And thanks to all of you for tuning in. I'm Maureen Kyle, and we'll see you right back here next time on Mom Squad.